I'm Marcia Massey, and this is the story of how my own son erased me with a single sentence, in front of a room full of people I thought would be celebrating our family. I still remember that night like it was stitched into my skin. The chandeliers above the reception hall sparkled, the laughter of guests carried over the music, and I sat quietly at my assigned table, hands folded in my lap. My heart swelled with pride just being there. After all, I had poured everything I had into this wedding. Over $150,000 of my hard-earned savings. It wasn't just money to me. It was the life I'd built, the hours I had sacrificed, and the love of a mother trying to give her only son the kind of beginning she believed he deserved. When David rose to speak, I braced myself for the moment I had been waiting for. That was my son, standing tall, looking sharp in his tuxedo, smiling as he held a microphone. "Hey boy." I told myself that no matter how much I had been brushed aside in the planning, this was the instant he would show the world who his real mother was. I straightened in my chair, the scar on my neck tugging as I lifted my chin. I wanted to be ready, but the words that came out of his mouth were not meant for me. "I want to thank Alice," he said, turning to the younger woman at my ex-husband's side. "She's been like a mother to me. In fact, she is my mother. She's the reason I stand here today, the man I am." Applause broke out. Glasses clinked. Alice pressed her manicured hand to her chest, pretending to fight back tears. And then, almost as an afterthought, David waved his hand in my direction. "And of course Marcia. She's helped so much with the household, always there keeping things tidy. She's like family. Really like the housekeeper who kept things running." Laughter rippled at a few tables. The words cut through me sharper than any blade could. My son, the child I had carried, nursed, clothed, fed, and sacrificed for, reduced me to a maid in front of his bride, her family, his friends, and even my ex-husband who sat smirking quietly. Froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I felt every eye slide over me, some with confusion, some with pity, others just brushing past without a thought. My cheeks burned, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I forced my back straight, let my lips press into the faintest of smiles, and swallowed the bile that had risen in my throat. Inside, though, I shattered. The rest of the speech blurred into meaningless sound. Toasts were raised, laughter filled the hall, but I didn't hear a word. My ears rang with only his betrayal. He had rewritten me, my own son, as if my motherhood had never existed, as if my sacrifices were invisible. And so I did the only thing I could to protect what little dignity I had left. I stood quietly, smoothed the hem of my dress, and walked out. I didn't make a scene. I didn't confront him. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I walked out into the cool night air, away from the music and the clinking glasses, and let the silence wrap around me. But as I walked across the parking lot, my heels clicking against the pavement, a storm brewed inside me. He thought he had silenced me. He thought he had buried me beneath shame and humiliation. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I still held the power to dismantle every false foundation he had built his life on. And that night, as tears stung my eyes but resolve hardened my spine, I vowed silently, if he could deny me as his mother, then I would show him in ways he'd never forget exactly who I was. Before I go further, I need you with me on this. Where are you watching from? Have you ever given everything to someone only to be humiliated in return? Share your experience in the comments. I want to know how many of you have walked through betrayal like this. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly that night that my fingers ached. The banquet hall lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the endless dark stretch of highway ahead. My dress still smelled faintly of perfume and champagne, but all I felt was the sting of humiliation clinging to me like smoke. My son's words echoed again and again. She's like the housekeeper who kept things running. That was how he described me after I had spent more than 62 years building my life around him, after I had poured every ounce of myself into raising him, and then emptied my bank account to give him a wedding he didn't deserve. The silence in the car was suffocating. I didn't even turn on the radio. I wanted to hear the truth of my own breathing, shallow and uneven. My mind replayed scenes like an old film reel, every frame sharper than the last. The years I spent cleaning other people's homes when David was little, just to make sure he had shoes that weren't worn through at the toes. The late nights I stayed up helping him with homework after working double shifts. The sacrifices I made to send him to law school, telling myself that all of it would be worth it when I saw him stand tall in his own success. And then the final blow, the wedding. I had written every check without complaint, from the flowers to the band, convincing myself that this was my gift of love to him. $150,000. That number ran through my head like a curse. I had traded my security, my retirement, the cushion I had worked a lifetime to build, for a moment I believed would unite our family. And in return I had been erased. Tears slid down my cheeks, but they weren't the soft tears of grief. They were hot, angry, bitter tears. I thought about every dollar I had signed away and how each one had purchased my own humiliation. And then something inside me shifted. That money wasn't gone. It wasn't wasted. It was a receipt, a record of how much I had given. And that receipt would become my proof when I decided to collect what was truly mine. As the car cut through the night, I began to notice how calm the streets were. Families were asleep in their homes, lights glowing softly in windows. I thought about all the mothers tucked in their beds, probably dreaming of their children with pride. Meanwhile, I was driving alone, scarred, humiliated, and cast aside. The loneliness pressed on me, but underneath it burned something stronger. Resolve. If David had stood on that stage and announced to the world that I was nothing more than his maid, then he had just given me permission to stop carrying him as a son. I parked in front of my house, the same house where I had raised him, the same house I had worked tooth and nail to hold on to after his father abandoned us. I sat in the driveway for a long time before cutting the engine, letting the ticking of the cooling car fill the silence. I knew then that silence would be my weapon. I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't beg for acknowledgement, I wouldn't demand respect. I would let my actions speak, slowly, carefully, and in ways that would strip him of everything he thought he owned. That drive home was the longest of my life. But it was also the beginning of something I had never imagined for myself. Revenge. I often tell myself that people see the glory but never know the story. They saw my son standing tall at that wedding, looking like he had built himself from the ground up. But if they had seen the early years, the real years, they would know he was standing on the back of a mother who had carried the weight alone. When David was little, our life was a constant struggle. His father, Charles, was always inconsistent. Some weeks he was there, playing the role of husband and father, and then the next he would vanish, chasing after business schemes or women who made him feel young again. I never knew if the rent would be paid on time or if I would be left juggling late notices and threats of eviction. And more often than not, it was me alone at the kitchen table late into the night, bills spread out in front of me, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold as I tried to make numbers stretch further than they could. I worked wherever I could find hours. By day, I held down steady work in an office, answering phones and filing papers for men who looked straight through me as if I were invisible. By night, I scrubbed the floors of other people's homes, polished their furniture, washed their linens, and left before sunrise so they would never see the woman who had quietly kept their lives neat and shining. I'd slip in while they were gone, clean their mess, and slip out like I had never existed. Then I'd hurry home to pack lunches, braid David's hair when he was still small, and walk him to school with a smile that hid how exhausted I really was. There were days when my body felt like it couldn't go on. I remember one night in particular when I came home from cleaning an office building, my hands raw from bleach water, and found David asleep at the kitchen table. He had waited up for me with his homework spread out. I sat down beside him, shook him gently awake, and helped him finish his math problems even though my eyes could barely focus. He hugged me that night and said, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know." I carried that sentence in my heart for years like a medal. That was before the world taught him to be ashamed of me. It wasn't glamorous. There were no vacations, no designer clothes, no nights out. Every dollar went to survival. Food on the table, gas in the car, and books for school. When Charles drifted back in, it was never to help shoulder the load. It was to criticize me for not keeping myself up, for looking tired, for not being enough of the woman he thought he deserved. And yet, despite his absence, despite the constant storm of instability, I made sure David never went without. He might not have had the latest gadgets, but he had clean clothes, meals every day, and a mother who would have laid down her life for him without hesitation. Looking back, I realize those years shaped me into steel. Sacrifice became my second language, dignity my shield. I never let my son see how deeply I was breaking down inside. He saw a mother who could handle anything, even if it meant swallowing her pride. What I didn't know then was that every sacrifice was also a seed that would later bloom into bitterness when he grew up and forgot the cost of his success. But that's the thing about seeds. They don't die just because people pretend not to notice them. They grow in silence, under the surface, until one day they break through with force. And as I think back on those early years, I see clearly now that my sacrifices weren't just the story of how I raised my son. They were the story of how I was preparing myself for the day I would reclaim everything he tried to take from me. Life has a way of knocking you down at the exact moment you think you found your footing. For me, it was the day the doctor leaned across his desk and said the word tumor. Thyroid, he explained. They would need to test, to cut, to monitor. I sat there frozen, my hands clenched in my lap, as though if I held still enough, maybe the word wouldn't stick. But it did. It stuck like glue to the walls of my mind. The months that followed felt like a blur of hospital visits, medication, and the cold touch of machines. The treatments were exhausting. My body weakened, my energy drained, and the scar that would forever mark my neck began to form. It wasn't just the physical toll. It was the mirror staring back at me every morning, reflecting a woman I barely recognized. The swelling around my neck made me self-conscious, and I found myself pulling scarves high, hiding from my own reflection as much as from the world outside. But the hardest blow didn't come from the diagnosis. It came from the man who was supposed to stand beside me through sickness and health. Charles grew distant. At first it was subtle. Shorter visits to the hospital, hurried phone calls. Then it became glaring. Excuses to stay late at work, silence at the dinner table, weekends away that he didn't bother to explain. The more fragile I became, the stronger his distance grew. And then one night, without argument or even a goodbye, he simply didn't come home. His things were gone. Just like that, he had left. I had always known Charles's love was shallow, but nothing prepared me for the cruelty of being abandoned when I needed him most. The betrayal cut deeper than any scalpel could. I was battling for my health, but I was also suddenly battling for survival, emotionally, financially, and as a mother. David was a teenager then, old enough to understand but too young to truly grasp the depth of the wound. Charles began parading Alice into his life. Young, vibrant, unscarred. She became a presence at events, a cheerful distraction from the mother who was tired, swollen, and marked by illness. Slowly, without realizing it, David's loyalties began to shift. He liked her easy smile, her polished words, her way of making him feel like he was stepping into a brighter, shinier world. And I, still recovering, could feel my son slipping further and further from my arms. The financial strain was relentless. Medical bills piled high, each envelope a reminder that sickness carried a price tag I could hardly afford. With Charles gone, every responsibility fell back on me. Even when my body cried out for rest, I dragged myself to work, covering shifts I had no strength for, scrubbing floors with trembling hands because rent and utilities didn't pause for cancer scares or broken marriages. Every scar, the one on my neck and the invisible ones in my heart, was earned in those nights when I fought to hold everything together alone. But what hurt most wasn't the bills, or even Charles's desertion. It was watching David look at me with growing shame, as though my illness had made me less. He didn't say it, not then, but I saw it in his eyes. Where once he told me I was the strongest woman he knew, now he looked at me as though I were fragile, embarrassing, something to be hidden. I told myself it was just teenage discomfort, that he would outgrow it. But deep down, I knew the fracture had begun. And standing at my mirror one night, staring at the angry scar running across my throat, I whispered a truth to myself I had never said out loud. They left me when I needed them most. But I am still here. That whisper became my anchor. They could take their distance, their polished images, their shallow love. But they couldn't take the fact that I was a survivor. When Charles left, he didn't leave me to heal in peace. He filled the void with someone new, someone younger, someone unscarred. Her name was Alice. The first time I saw her, it was at a school event for David. She walked in on Charles's arm with a confidence that was hard to ignore. Head high, clothes pristine, every step calculated to be noticed. And noticed she was. Even David's friends looked at her with curiosity, some whispering about how stylish she seemed. I sat a few rows back, scarf pulled tight around my neck, trying to shrink into the seat. Alice was everything Charles thought I wasn't anymore. She was polished where I was tired, glamorous where I was plain, healthy where I was healing. And she wasted no time slipping into the cracks my illness and Charles's betrayal had left behind. She didn't scold David when his grades slipped, she flattered him. She didn't lecture him about responsibilities. She laughed and made him feel important. Slowly, I watched as she positioned herself not just as Charles's companion, but as a new kind of mother in my son's eyes. David was drawn to her. At first, it was the small things, how she remembered his favorite snacks, how she bought him gifts just because. Then it became more serious. She started helping him with things I had always managed. School applications, birthday parties, even simple advice he once sought from me. I could feel him slipping away with every passing month. It wasn't that he stopped loving me entirely, but he began to look at me differently. Where Alice sparkled with youth and confidence, I was the reminder of struggle and scars. I knew it in the way he hesitated to invite his friends over to my small, tidy house, but bragged about weekends at his father's with Alice. I saw it in how he rushed to tell me stories about things Alice had said or done, as if waiting for my approval, as though her opinion carried more weight than mine. And slowly, he began to look embarrassed when I showed up in my work uniform, or when I wore the scarves that hid the swelling in my neck. It was as though he decided one version of mother was acceptable and another was not, and I was the one being pushed out. Alice never had to say much to me directly. Her power was in what she didn't say. The polite smiles, the subtle way she placed a hand on David's shoulder in my presence, the faint tone of ownership in her voice when she referred to him as our boy. It was a quiet theft, and I stood by powerless as she rewrote herself into his life. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that David would grow older and see through the surface of it all. That he would remember who had been there through every fever, every scraped knee, every night of hunger disguised as a smaller portion on my plate so he could eat more. But deep down I feared something else. That Charles and Alice's polish, their charm, their pretense of success, would permanently reshape the way my son saw me. Not as the backbone of his life, but as the scarred woman who cleaned other people's messes to keep him afloat. And in time I realized that was exactly what was happening. There are nights etched into my memory so vividly that I can still smell the sting of bleach and the bitter taste of strong coffee that kept me upright. Those were the nights I carried the world on my shoulders while my son slept peacefully, never knowing how much it took to keep his dreams alive. When David got accepted into law school, I cried tears of joy. Not because I doubted his ability, but because I knew how much it would cost. Tuition, books, living expenses, all on top of the bills that already seemed to grow taller each month. His father, Charles, made a show of pride at family gatherings, but when the envelopes arrived in the mail, it was my hands that opened them, my account that paid them. I picked up extra shifts at the office during the day, but it was never enough. So at night, when the rest of the world slept, I changed out of my heels and slipped into sneakers, grabbed a bucket and rags, and headed to downtown buildings where the lights never went out. There I scrubbed floors until my back screamed, polished desks that had been carelessly left sticky with coffee rings, and emptied trash bins full of papers that men in suits would never think twice about. Every paycheck from those hours was spoken for before it hit my hands. Tuition first, then books, then rent. Some mornings I would stumble home just as the sun was rising, too exhausted to cook breakfast, but forcing myself to anyway. I'd set a plate in front of David, urging him to eat while I hid my trembling hands beneath the table. He never knew that the reason his tuition was paid on time wasn't because of loans or scholarships, but because his mother's knees were raw from scrubbing. I made sure he never knew. I wanted him to believe his life was stable, that his path was paved, that success was within his reach without the weight of my sacrifice shadowing him. But my body kept the score. The tumor in my neck was healing, but the scar was still fresh and angry. I wore scarves in every season, tugging them up even in summer heat, because I couldn't stand the way people's eyes lingered on it. At work, I noticed colleagues glancing too long, then looking away politely. On buses, strangers gave quick double takes. And at home, my own son began to avoid looking directly at it. I could feel his discomfort. He never said a word, but silence can be louder than words. It was the silence of a boy ashamed of how his mother looked. Still I pressed forward. Each time I pulled out my checkbook, each time I dropped another envelope in the mailbox with "payment enclosed" stamped across it, I reminded myself this was the price of his future. This was my investment, not in stocks or property, but in a boy I believed would one day turn into a man who would remember who carried him here. The irony is that the very sacrifices I made became the reasons he drifted away. He saw the cleaning jobs as something to be embarrassed of, the scar as something ugly, the exhaustion as weakness. Where I saw proof of survival, he saw reminders of poverty and illness. And that distance between what I meant and what he saw grew wider every year. But I never stopped. Even when my bones ached, even when I went home and wrapped heating pads around my back just to get a few hours of rest before another shift, I kept going. Because that's what mothers do. We break ourselves to build our children whole. And yet, sitting here now looking back, I realize something. Every check I wrote, every shift I worked, every scar I carried was more than sacrifice. It was power. Power he would one day regret underestimating. Because while he thought he was erasing me from his story, I was writing chapters he would never be able to undo. When David first told me he was getting married, I felt a joy so sharp it nearly cut me. I pictured myself finally watching my sacrifices bloom into something beautiful, a day when he would stand proud, and I would stand beside him as his mother, honored for the role I had played in bringing him there. But almost immediately, that joy was tempered with the weight of responsibility. Weddings of the kind he wanted were expensive, and though I had already given him more than most mothers could ever dream of, he looked to me again. And I, as always, opened my savings, draining what little security I had left. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the suits, one by one I wrote the checks. Each payment was a piece of my retirement, a piece of the future I had once imagined for myself. But I told myself it was worth it. This was his day, and my duty as a mother was to make it shine. The irony, of course, was that the more money I poured in, the less voice I seemed to have. I was not asked which songs should play, or which colors should decorate the hall. I was not invited to the food tastings or the meetings with photographers. Charles and Alice were there for those. I would hear later about how Alice suggested the cake flavor, or how she accompanied them to pick out centerpieces. Her name threaded into every detail that should have been mine. I tried not to let it sting. I told myself it was enough to know I was funding it, that my love was written into every detail even if my name wasn't. But small humiliations began to pile up, too subtle to make a scene over, but sharp enough to leave scars. One day, when we sat down to discuss seating arrangements, I noticed my name wasn't on the head table list. I asked about it gently, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. David cleared his throat and said, "Mom, it'll just be simpler this way. We don't want to confuse the guests." I stared at him, confused them how. I was his mother. But then he moved on quickly, talking about the order of speeches, as if my presence at the table wasn't worth a second thought. Another time, I found out that the bride's family had been told Alice was playing a major role in the wedding planning, as though she were the one who had earned that position, not me. The message was clear, even if it wasn't spoken outright. Alice fit the image they wanted to present, while I was better off in the shadows. I kept telling myself it was nerves, that weddings were stressful, that maybe I was reading too much into things. But in my gut I knew. I knew the stage was being set for something worse. Every receipt I filed away, every check I signed, felt like a stone I was laying in the foundation of a house where I wasn't welcome. And yet I continued because I thought love and sacrifice could cover the cracks. I thought that money would translate to honor. But the truth was simmering just beneath the surface. And as the date drew closer, I could feel it pressing down on me. The sense that the same love I was pouring out would be used as the very weapon to cut me down. The room was lit like a dream, golden chandeliers shimmering above, crystal glasses catching the light, and soft music humming in the background. I sat at my table, spine straight, hands folded neatly in my lap, waiting. It was the moment every mother dreams of, the moment she is introduced not just as a guest, but as the heart behind the man standing in front of the world. I waited for my name. David took the microphone with a smile so broad it nearly split his face. His bride glowed beside him, her family beaming with pride. My chest swelled, even after all the subtle humiliations that had preceded this night. I told myself this was it. The moment he would look at me, his real mother, and acknowledge everything I had done to carry him here. Instead, he turned to Alice. "I want to thank Alice," he began, his voice strong and sure. "She's been like a mother to me. In fact, she is my mother. She's the reason I stand here today as the man I am." Applause thundered through the hall. Glasses clinked. His words rolled over me like ice water. Alice pressed her manicured hand to her chest and gave a dainty, tearful nod, her lips trembling just enough to seem sincere. Guests leaned in, smiling at her, whispering to one another, their eyes filled with admiration. And then, with the casual cruelty of someone brushing lint from a jacket, David gestured toward me. And of course Marcia, she's helped so much with the household, always there keeping things tidy. She's like family. Really like the housekeeper who kept things running. A few guests laughed softly, unsure if it was meant as a joke. Others glanced at me briefly, some with pity, others with confusion, before turning their attention back to him. I felt every gaze cut across me like a blade. Charles sat in silence, his face betraying nothing. Not a word of correction, not even the smallest gesture to acknowledge me. He allowed Alice to bask in a false crown, smiling faintly as though everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. Alice leaned into the attention, soaking in every glance and compliment that followed. She dabbed the corner of her eye with a napkin, playing the part of the honored matriarch. She didn't need to say a word. The applause, the smiles, the way people reached to shake her hand, it told me everything. In that room at that moment, she had successfully stolen what was mine. I sat frozen, hands clenched tight beneath the tablecloth. The walls of the hall seemed to close in, the music muffled, the air heavy. I had been reduced to nothing in the very space I had paid for, in the celebration I had built with my sacrifices. It was as though my motherhood had been stripped from me in front of everyone, erased with a single sentence. The crushing weight of it pressed into my chest. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake working, of the mornings I had dragged myself out of bed despite illness, of the checks I had written with trembling hands. And all of it had led to this, the public denial of who I was. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply sat in that chair, forcing a faint smile onto my lips, though inside I was crumbling. Dignity was the only shield I had left. When the applause faded, I rose quietly, smoothed the fabric of my dress, and walked out of the hall. No one followed. No one stopped me. I left them to their laughter, their music, their toasts built on lies. But as I stepped into the night air, a truth settled into me heavier than anything I had ever carried. My son had killed something inside me that night. And yet, in doing so, he had awakened something else, something that would not stay silent. The air outside the banquet hall was crisp, the kind of air that should have refreshed me, but instead it carried the sting of everything I had just endured. Behind me, laughter and music spilled faintly through the closed doors. Inside, my son was celebrating his new life while erasing mine. But I didn't rush back in. I didn't demand to be heard. I didn't beg for recognition. I walked away, quietly, deliberately, each step carrying more meaning than any words could. There is a power in silence that most people don't understand. To them, silence looks like defeat. To me, that night, it became the very first act of my revenge. By refusing to fight publicly, I denied them the spectacle they expected. They wanted me to break, to cry out, to lose control so they could say, "See, this is why we didn't acknowledge her." Instead, I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked with a grace they could never take from me. I would not let them watch me crumble. As my heels tapped against the pavement, the symbolism of it all weighed on me. My son had thrown away his dignity in front of everyone by diminishing the woman who made him. But I had kept mine intact by leaving without a scene. He thought he had silenced me, but silence can roar louder than any outburst. It leaves people unsettled, wondering what storm might be building beneath the stillness. Walking away meant I took the power with me. Inside that hall they toasted lies. Outside I carried the truth, the receipts of every sacrifice, every dollar, every scar. They believed I was erased, but I knew better. I had not lost my voice. I was choosing when and how to use it. And when I did, it would not be in front of a crowd that applauded falsehoods. It would be in ways that stripped them piece by piece until there was nothing left but the truth they had tried to bury. I remember stopping briefly by my car, one hand pressed against the cool metal, steadying myself. My eyes burned with unshed tears, but my heart beat with something new, resolve. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. My dignity wasn't lost. It was sharpened into a weapon. In that quiet exit, I set the tone for everything that would come after. They thought I was walking away from the wedding. What they didn't know was that I was walking toward their reckoning. When I got home that night, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I sat in the dark, shoes still on my feet, dress still clinging to me, staring into the quiet. The humiliation from the wedding clung to me like smoke, but as the hours passed, the silence gave birth to something else. Memory. My eyes drifted to the old wooden cabinet in the corner, to the bottom drawer where I had tucked away papers years ago. Papers that told a story my son had long forgotten, or perhaps had never truly known. That house, the one he now lived in and boasted about to his friends, had not simply fallen into his lap. It had been fought for, inch by inch, dollar by dollar, when Charles and I split apart. Divorce is never clean, and ours was brutal. Charles wanted everything: the house, the car, even accounts he had hardly contributed to. He believed walking out meant walking away with the spoils, leaving me with scraps. But I wouldn't let him. That house was more than bricks and wood. It was where I had rocked David to sleep as a baby, where I had patched holes in school uniforms, where I had held us together when Charles wandered off chasing someone new. I fought tooth and nail to keep it, and I won. The memory came back sharp, sitting across from Charles in that courtroom, his lawyer smirking as though I didn't stand a chance. My hands had trembled, but my voice had not. I laid out proof of every payment I had made, every sacrifice, every dollar that had gone into maintaining that house. And when the ruling came down, it was mine. My name on the deed. My signature on the mortgage. My home and no one else's. In the years that followed, I worked endlessly to keep it. Bills piled high, repairs drained my pockets, but I never let it go. And when David grew older, needing a place to live while building his life, I let him move in. I told myself it was what mothers did, making sure their children had a foundation, even if it meant I shouldered the burden. He lived there as if it were his own, decorating, inviting friends over, even speaking as though he had earned it. I never corrected him. I thought my silence was love. I thought letting him believe it was his would help him feel strong. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his betrayal, I saw my silence differently. I had handed him the illusion of ownership, when the truth had been folded neatly into that bottom drawer all along. The title deed, the documents with my name in bold, they were still there, untouched, waiting for the day I might need to remember who really built this life. I rose from the chair, walked to the cabinet, and pulled open the drawer. My hands brushed past old photographs, birthday cards, and school certificates until they landed on the stiff weight of paper. I pulled the file out, flipped it open, and there it was, proof. Proof that the house my son so proudly showed off was mine. Proof that every dollar he spent inside those walls was spent under my roof, not his. A bitter smile crept across my lips. David didn't even know he was living beneath the weight of my sacrifice. He thought he had erased me at his wedding, but these papers told another story. A story that could unravel everything he thought he owned. That night, as I laid the documents across the table, a seed of revenge took root in me. I no longer felt like the erased mother who walked out of a banquet hall unseen. I felt like the woman who held the keys to his downfall. And for the first time in a long while, I slept with a sense of control returning to my chest. I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight, The stack of papers spread out before me like witnesses to a trial only I could hear. The title deed, the receipts, the documents that carried my name. They were reminders of every battle I had fought and won, even when the world told me I would lose. Around me the house was quiet, but my mind roared with decades of memories. Betrayal had never been a stranger to me. Charles had betrayed me when he walked out during my illness. Alice had betrayed me by slipping into my place, smiling as though she had earned my sacrifices. And now my son David, the child I had carried, fed and fought for, had delivered the sharpest betrayal of all. The weight of it sat heavy in my chest. For years I had mistaken silence for peace. I told myself I was keeping the family together by swallowing my pride, by letting things go, by pretending not to see the distance growing. But what had it earned me? A wedding where I was erased, my motherhood reduced to servitude, my sacrifices turned into punchlines. I rose and walked to the mirror in the hallway. The light was dim, but I could still see the scar across my throat, pale and jagged against my skin. For years I had hidden it beneath scarves, ashamed of what it signified. The illness that nearly took me, the weakness Charles couldn't bear, the reminder of a season when my body betrayed me. But staring at it now I saw something different. That scar wasn't weakness. It was survival. It meant I had endured. It meant I had been left alone and still found a way to live. I traced it gently with my fingers and whispered to my reflection, "This is not my shame. This is my proof." In that moment something inside me shifted. I was no longer the woman who would bow her head and accept humiliation. I was no longer the mother who would give endlessly while being erased. I was a survivor, marked but unbroken, scarred but stronger. I sat back down at the table, gathered the papers, and placed them neatly in front of me. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would not be silent anymore. The same strength that carried me through nights of scrubbing floors and days of healing from surgeries would now carry me through a different kind of battle. This one wasn't for survival. It was for dignity. I would remind David and Charles that everything they stood on was built by me. And if they could not honor me as their foundation, then I would show them how easily that foundation could be pulled away. That night I made my decision. Silence had been my prison, but now it would be my weapon. The morning after I made my decision, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. For too long I had been the giver, the silent one, the woman who bent so others could stand taller. But that version of me had walked out of the wedding hall and never returned. The woman who rose from bed that morning was someone else, someone ready to act. I started with the papers I had pulled from the drawer the night before. The title deed, the proof of ownership, the documentation that carried my name in bold print. This wasn't sentiment. It was power. With it, I went to the courthouse and began the process of reclaiming what was mine. Eviction papers were drawn, stamped, and placed in a crisp envelope. My hands didn't shake when I held them. They felt steady, almost eager. It wasn't long before David and his new bride got the shock of their lives. They had barely returned from their honeymoon when I showed up at the house. The very house they called theirs, the one they flaunted on social media with wide smiles and captions about new beginnings. I stood at the doorway with the envelope in my hand, the weight of decades balanced on my shoulders. David answered, looking surprised to see me. His wife lingered behind him, still glowing in the aftertaste of wedding celebrations. "Mom," he said, his voice edged with caution, as though he hadn't quite decided how to treat me after what happened at the dinner. I handed him the envelope. "Open it," I said simply. He tore it open, his eyes skimming the words. Confusion clouded his face at first, then disbelief, then a sharp edge of panic. His bride stepped forward, snatching the papers from his hands, reading them with widening eyes. "Eviction," she whispered, her voice tight. This is a mistake." But it wasn't. I laid the title deed on the entry table for them to see. My name, in bold letters, stared back at them. "This house is mine," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "It always has been. You've been living here under my roof, on my grace. But that grace is gone. You have 30 days to leave." David's face flushed, a mix of shock and anger. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "This is my home." I met his eyes without flinching. "No, David. This is my home. And you will not erase me while living off the very foundation I built." Silence hung heavy in the room. His bride looked between us, her expression faltering. The truth was undeniable, written in ink that could not be argued away. For the first time in his life, David was seeing the woman behind his comfort, the backbone he had mistaken for weakness. I turned to leave, my heels steady against the hardwood floors. Behind me their voices rose, confusion, anger, desperation. But none of it moved me. I had taken the first piece from them, and it would not be the last. As I stepped outside, the sun hit my face, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. My silence had ended. My revenge had begun. Taking back the house was only the first blow. It stripped away the illusion that David stood on his own 2 feet, but I knew that without going further, he would still cling to other crutches I had quietly provided. Over the years, I had been the silent hand behind so much of his comfort: co-signed accounts, hidden support, credit cards he never realized I controlled. Now it was time to sever those strings, one by one, until the safety net he thought was his birthright collapsed beneath him. The first step was the joint account I had kept open for emergencies. For years, I deposited small amounts into it, just in case David ever fell behind on bills or needed help. He had grown so accustomed to money appearing when he overspent that he never questioned it. That account was closed with a single signature. No warning, no explanation. One day he swiped his card at a restaurant, and it declined. That was my silence speaking. Next were the credit cards. I had co-signed for him when he was younger, wanting to build his credit, wanting him to start strong. But those cards had become more than tools. They were lifelines he leaned on when his own spending spiraled. With one phone call, I canceled my ties to them. Overnight, his safety cushion was gone, and the debt he had piled up began knocking at his own door instead of mine. Then there were the bills I had been paying in secret. The car insurance, covered quietly every month. The lingering student loan payment I had chipped away at behind the scenes so he could focus on his career without the stress of debt collectors. All of it stopped. For the first time in his life, David was forced to face the reality of adulthood without me standing in the shadows absorbing the blows. But it wasn't just David. Charles, too, had grown fat off my silence. There were still remnants of financial ties left from the marriage. Accounts and old agreements I had never pressed him on, utilities he had leaned on me to cover when it benefited him. Pulled those threads as well. The man who once prided himself on being the image of stability began to feel the walls closing in. Bills arrived in his mailbox without warning, balances called in full, obligations resurfacing after years of being buried under my patience. The unraveling was steady and deliberate. I didn't announce it, didn't storm in with accusations or ultimatums. I simply withdrew. One tie at a time, one quiet cut after another, until the very fabric of their false lives began to tear apart. I knew the effect it was having without even being in the room. The phone calls that came late at night, unanswered. The messages filled with urgency that I deleted without opening. I could picture the arguments behind their doors, the confusion, the panic as they realized the ground beneath them wasn't theirs at all. Had always been mine. And through it all, I remained silent, steady, unmoved. They thought they had erased me, but what they were learning was that my presence had been stitched into every corner of their comfort. By cutting those stitches, I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine. I was forcing them to live without the mother, without the woman they had spent years dismissing. This was only the second blow, but already their foundation was trembling. Charles had always believed himself untouchable. When he left me during my illness, when he flaunted Alice at David's milestones, when he sat silently as I was humiliated at the wedding, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who thought the world would never hold him accountable. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the cracks forming beneath their feet. And I knew exactly where those cracks were buried, because I had lived them, paid for them, and carried them on my back long after he walked away. The divorce had left behind loose ends Charles thought would remain forgotten. Financial threads tucked into accounts he once controlled, obligations he never fully met, debts he assumed I was too weary to chase. But I hadn't forgotten. And now I wasn't weary. I was ready. With a steady hand, I reopened old records. Bank statements, court filings, agreements that Charles had sidestepped over the years. He had avoided certain payments during the divorce by convincing the court of his financial hardship that never truly existed. I knew the truth then, but I had let it go, more concerned with survival than justice. Now justice was my revenge. I submitted evidence to the right offices, let the numbers speak for themselves, and watched as the past came roaring back to his doorstep. The effect was immediate. Calls from creditors, unexpected legal notices, inquiries into accounts he thought buried. Charles's carefully maintained image of stability began to unravel. The polished exterior he presented at church, at dinners, at gatherings with Alice by his side, was cracking. And Alice, who had once seemed untouchable, began to shift in the shadows. She had been attracted to the confidence, the illusion of success, the man who looked like he had it all together. But as the facade crumbled, so did her devotion. I heard whispers, her tone sharper in public, her presence at his side less consistent, her laughter thinner. She had signed up to play the part of admired partner, not caretaker of a man losing his grip. And David? He was reeling from his own unraveling. Evicted from the home he thought was his, cards declined, bills mounting. He looked to his father for strength, but what he found was a mirror image of his own collapse. Father and son, both stripped of the illusions they had built on my sacrifice, now stood exposed. The foundation they thought was theirs was gone, and the truth was unavoidable. It had always been mine. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to show my face. My silence had become their storm. Charles's reputation, once held up by falsehoods and polished lies, was now stained by the weight of his failures. And Alice, the woman who once looked at me with subtle triumph, was quietly stepping back, distancing herself from a man who could no longer provide the shine she craved. Father and son thought they had erased me. But now, together, they were learning that everything they had stood on was borrowed, and the lender had come to collect. It was late evening when I heard the knock. First I didn't move. The weight of silence filled the house, the same silence I had lived in when Charles left, the same silence I carried home from David's wedding dinner. But this time, the silence didn't belong to despair. It belonged to strength. I opened the door, and there he was. David, my son, no longer the proud groom, no longer the polished attorney's child who believed appearances could replace truth. He looked broken. His clothes were wrinkled, his face drawn, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The arrogance that once dripped from his voice was gone. He stood there as though he was searching for something he had lost long ago. The mother he had dismissed, erased, humiliated. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. I didn't move aside. I let him stand there in the doorway, the night air cool against us both. Finally he whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry." And that was when I took him back, not into my home but into his own past. I reminded him of nights when I worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. I reminded him of mornings when I went without food so he could eat. I reminded him of the tuition checks I signed with trembling hands, knowing it meant I couldn't repair the leaking roof or buy medicine I desperately needed. I painted the picture of sacrifice, a picture etched with love, with suffering, with the hope that he would grow into a man who would honor where he came from. Then I contrasted it with what he had given me, shame. A wedding dinner where I was stripped of my title as mother, reduced to a servant in front of strangers. A lifetime of choosing others over me, siding with a man who abandoned us and a woman who had no stake in his upbringing. I let the silence hang heavy after my words. David's tears fell, but I didn't reach to wipe them. That was his grief to carry. Forgiveness was not mine to give freely anymore. Forgiveness had been cheapened the moment he chose pride over blood. The true revenge, I realized in that moment, was not in punishing him further. It was in reclaiming myself, my dignity, my voice, my power. Whether I forgave him or not no longer defined me. What defined me was that I had survived, endured, and risen. I told him plainly, "You chose who I was at that dinner. But tonight I choose who I am." And I left it at that. Whether he found a way back into my life or stood outside forever was no longer my burden to carry. The door remained where it always had been, but the power to open it, to step through it, belonged to me now. And for the first time in decades I felt free. Tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you forgive? Or would you let him live with the weight of his choices? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your answers might just spark the deepest part of this conversation. If you followed this journey to the end, don't just leave. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story of betrayal, resilience, and power reclaimed. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the beginning of the loudest revenge.